I'm Roy Lee Lindsay with the North Carolina Pork Council, and I want everyone to remember bacon makes everything better.
Welcome to This Week in College Football with David Glenn, brought to you by the North Carolina Pork Council. Thanks so much for joining us for our show again this week. I'm Chris Edwards, so happy to be back for year 2 here on our quickly growing North Carolina Sports Network. On our show this week and every week, DG and I will mostly look ahead to the upcoming college football games. This week, we'll also discuss college football's biggest headlines and take a quick glance back with some of DG's expert analysis on the biggest games and developments in the previous week's schedule. DG now in his 38th year covering football both here in North Carolina and around the Atlantic Coast Conference. DG, always good to be with you, my friend.
I am doing great, Chris. It's great to see you again, and I am ready to dive in.
All right, well, let's get to it. Segment 1 here. We call it our 3 to See, looking ahead to the biggest games involving North Carolina teams here in Week 5. We, of course, will get to those ugly losses suffered by both North Carolina and NC State last week. Whew. But first, let's look ahead to this week's action with a Week 5, a few very important storylines involving in-state teams. This segment brought to you by our great friends at Atlantic Tire and Service, where DG and his family take all of their vehicles for routine maintenance, service needs, and world-class selection of new tires. Atlantic Tire and Service, where they are also very proficient in delivering consistent quality fleet service. If you or your company needs a partner in that regard, they've grown to 6 Triangle area locations, 2 in Raleigh, 2 in Cary, 1 in Durham, 1 in Wake Forest. You can learn more at AtlanticTireOnline.com. Okay, DG, we'll dive right in. The battle for the victory bell this week at Wallace Wade Stadium, Saturday, 4 o'clock, 3-1 North Carolina at 4-0 Duke. This game on ESPN2. The Blue Devils opening up as a 3-point home favorite at Wallace Wade Stadium.
Yeah, I may spend the most time on this one out of all the national or regional or local games that we discussed today, Chris, just because it's 2 of the teams right here in our backyard in the Triangle. I think everybody knows Carolina has dominated this rivalry historically, winning more than 2/3 of the time, going way back into the century-plus machine. And the Tar Heels also have dominated this rivalry lately, winning all 5 head-to-head matchups against the Blue Devils during Coach Mack Brown's current tenure in Chapel Hill. But this time, Duke has the better record, 4-0 versus the Tar Heels 3-1, albeit a 4-0 mark against inferior opponents for the Blue Devils. Maybe more importantly, the Devils are playing with more confidence right now under their new head coach, Manny Diaz, especially on the defensive side of the ball. Remember that Mike Elko was a defensive-oriented coach these last 2 years in Durham before taking the Texas A&M job. Well, Manny Diaz is a defensive-oriented coach who these last 2 years was the defensive coordinator for some really good units at Penn State. So the Devils have a well-constructed plan on that side of the ball, and they've been executing that defensive game plan really well so far this season. Duke has given up an average of only 15 points per game. Now, it was against Elon, Northwestern, UConn, and Middle Tennessee State. Not one of those opponents is known for its dynamic offense, and those opponents' collective record, by the way, is 6 wins and 10 losses, and neither Duke nor any of those 4 opponents has defeated anybody of significance so far this season. So it's all a matter of context. Because UNC has an All-American running back in Omarion Hampton, and because the 5th-year senior quarterback, Jacoby Criswell, energized the Tar Heels' passing attack as they put up 50 points against James Madison last week in defeat. This will be the toughest challenge for that Duke defense so far this season. Carolina is coming off that embarrassing 70-50 loss at home to JMU. There were some irresponsible post-game reports that head coach Mack Brown had chosen to resign in the locker room after that game. And we'll talk about his status later in today's show, along with some other head coaches here in North Carolina. But the strangest part about the Tar Heels 3-1 start is that in their 3 victories, their defense and special teams were mostly good, and their offense, besides Omarion Hampton at running back, was mostly holding them back. Well, in their 1 loss, obviously, that script completely flipped, totally flipped. They somehow put up 50 points with their 3rd-string quarterback, Jacoby Criswell, a guy who had never started a single game against an FBS opponent in his entire 5-year career, and he was playing behind an extremely inexperienced offensive line for Carolina, which we discussed earlier this year. That combination leading to 50 points actually implies good coaching by the offensive staff heading into the James Madison game. Yet, of course, the UNC defense absolutely melted down against a JMU offense, and this is what makes it especially crazy and hard to figure out. A JMU offense that Chris had managed only 13 points in its previous game against Gardner-Webb, an FCS opponent here in North Carolina. Now, how does JMU go straight from 13 points against Gardner-Webb to 70 points against the Tar Heels, the most ever scored against the Heels by an opponent at Kenan Stadium? I mean, credit to the Dukes, of course, but UNC also looked poorly prepared. There was literally a major missed assignment on the first defensive snap of the game that led to a lone quarterback keeper. The Tar Heel defense somehow lost the battle in the trenches to a group of 5 team, and in the end, they gave up more than 600 yards of total offense. There are, final thought on Duke Carolina, there are 2 really good running backs in this game. Of course, Hampton from UNC. For Duke, it's a guy named Star Thomas. You better be good if that's your first name, right? Star Thomas is a transfer from New Mexico State, and he's worked his way to the top of the Duke depth chart at running back. There are also 2 up-and-down quarterbacks in this game. Malik Murphy of Duke, the Texas transfer, and Jacoby Criswell of Carolina. They both throw the ball into trouble areas too often, risking turnovers, but they've both made some really, really nice and big plays down the field as well. I would guess that quarterback play is going to go a long way toward determining who gets the victory bell this year. And that also means that whoever protects their quarterback better and whoever harasses and disrupts the opposing quarterback better will probably win this game. Neither of these teams has a great offensive line right now, so whichever defensive front 7 can better capitalize on that opponent's weakness is probably going to win. Carolina has really missed its star edge rusher, Kamen Rucker, who has been out with an injury. As we speak, it is not clear when Rucker is going to return to the lineup. Duke is the favorite here, in part because the Devils are at home, and because I think in part because they've just been the more consistent team on both sides of the ball so far this year.
All right, let's look at game 2, a nice regional matchup here. 4-0 Liberty on the road at Appalachian State. The Mountaineers are 2-2. This is a 3:30 kick on ESPN Plus on Saturday. Liberty opens up as a 3-point road favorite at Kid Brewer Stadium. That'll also be the side of our Old North State tailgate and traveling sports circus this week.
Yeah, our good friend Mike Waddell wears many hats for our company. Weatherman is going to be an additional hat that he wears this week because apparently there's a hurricane coming up the west coast of Florida that could disrupt parts of the college football weekend, maybe even including the western part of the great state of North Carolina. So stay tuned to our website, ncsportsnetwork.com, just in case there are any changes along those lines. Regardless, to me, this is a fascinating battle between one of the most consistently successful college football programs of the last decade, meaning App State, and one of the most consistently successful and fast-rising coaches in college football in 47-year-old Jamie Chadwell, who is now in his 2nd season at Liberty after having great success at both Charleston Southern at the FCS level and then Coastal Carolina at the FBS level. Anyone who may remember the story of the currently injured NC State quarterback Grayson McCall, who was a 3-time Sun Belt Player of the Year for the Chanticleers, Jamie Chadwell was McCall's coach and quarterbacks guru with the Chanticleers. So there's one more connection for you here locally. Last season, in Coach Chadwell's debut at Liberty, it's easy to forget because we're North Carolina-centric and ACC-centric here in this part of the country. The Flames went 13-1 last year. They won the Conference USA title, and they played in the Fiesta Bowl. Chadwell was the conference's coach of the year. A Tennessee transfer, a guy named Caden Salter, was the league's most valuable player. And a Wake Forest transfer, running back Quentin Cooley, was the CUSA newcomer of the year. Now, all of those guys are back. The coach, those players, they're back with the Flames, and they've been key parts of their 4-0 start, including that 35-24 victory for Liberty over East Carolina just last week up in Lynchburg. Now, App State was embarrassed at home last Thursday night on national television, falling 48-14 to South Alabama at Kid Brewer Stadium. Earlier this year, remember, the Mountaineers also got waxed 66-20 by Clemson at Death Valley, although that could happen to a lot of teams, as NC State found out the hard way just last week. As I mentioned, App State is one of the winningest programs in the entire FBS ranks over the past decade. The only programs with more victories during that period are, wait for this, in order, Alabama, Clemson, Georgia, Ohio State, Oklahoma, and Notre Dame. That is some really impressive company for the Mountaineers, obviously, and they're usually especially difficult to beat at The Rock, which is a great place to watch a college football game. It's why we go there every year, and where the Mountaineers have actually led the entire nation in some years in terms of attendance compared to capacity. They were way over 100% in that category last year. I don't know if that's news for the local fire marshals, but it's good news for App State football's attendance. This year's Mountaineers, though, so far have looked more like the Sean Clark team that went only 6-6 2 years ago. That was, remember, the only the second Mountaineers non-winning season of the past 30 years. And this year's team, for now, looks less like his 21 and 2023 teams, which won a combined 19 games and made it to the Sun Belt Conference championship game in both of those years. The number one area of concern that I have as the Mountaineers try to match up against Liberty is the Mountaineers' defense. It's given up a Sun Belt worst 36 points per game and almost 6 yards per rushing attempt, and it just couldn't get either the Clemson offense or, more alarmingly, the South Alabama offense off the field. That will have to change if the Mountaineers are going to spring an upset on Saturday afternoon. Quick PS, we are scheduled to be there, as you mentioned. We're typically just outside Kid Brewer Stadium in the hours leading up to what in this year's case is a 3:30 kickoff. But we'll also be watching the aftermath of Hurricane Helene to see just how that may impact the western part of North Carolina on Saturday, and maybe even a broader chunk of this extended college football weekend. Again, folks can check our website for updates a little bit closer to game time.
All right, our third game this week, 2-1 Northern Illinois, one of the wins, a big win on the road at Notre Dame. They are at 2-2 NC State. Wolfpack off that big loss at Clemson on Saturday. This is a noon game from Carter Finley on the CW. NC State a 7-point home favorite this week.
Yeah, this one has several compelling angles to me. One, Wolfpack coach Dave Doran has been a head coach at only two places, and now those two schools are playing each other head-to-head for just the second time in history. Coach Doran, it's easy to forget, went 11-3 and 12-1 in his two seasons as the head coach at Northern Illinois. That was back in 2011 and 2012. He won the Mid-American Conference Championship both of those years, and that is what caught the attention of then athletic director at NC State, Debbie Yao, more than a decade ago when she hired Doran to be Tom O'Brien's successor in Raleigh. Number two, this year's Northern Illinois team, remember, beat number 5 Notre Dame 16-14 in South Bend. That was less than 3 weeks ago. And it was actually ranked, Northern Illinois, in the national top 25 temporarily before being upset in overtime at home last week by Buffalo, another MAC team. Number 3, after pretty high preseason expectations, this year's Wolfpack has played 4 games this season and has not looked great in any of the 4. The Pack was embarrassed 51-10 by Tennessee and Charlotte and annihilated 59-35 last week at Clemson. Now remember, the Tigers led that game 45-7 at halftime at Death Valley. And that halftime score to me was a much better reflection of reality than the much closer final score, which came only after Clemson head coach Dabo Swinney called off the Dogs. Even during its close wins over Western Carolina and Louisiana Tech, the Pack did not look all that special. And, of course, they lost their starting quarterback, Grayson McCall, the Coastal Carolina transfer, to an injury along the way. The true freshman quarterback, C.J. Bailey, survived what you and I described as the evil genius challenge 1 week ago. Although he turned it over twice, he was sacked twice, and to be fair, his better numbers did come against the Clemson backups after the game had been decided. Lastly, the most surprising aspect of NC State's season to me so far has been that the Wolfpack just hasn't been very good in the trenches to this point. That's where Dave Doran's teams have been the most consistent over this past decade plus. And right now, neither the Pack offensive line nor the Pack's defensive front 6 or 7 has been much of a bright spot. What was my number one reason not to put the Pack among the ACC's true contenders back in August? The departure of linebacker Peyton Wilson, one of the best players in NC State football history. Now, maybe Davin Vann or Fred Cleveland up front, maybe Caden Fordham or Sean Brown at linebacker. Those guys are promising talents in some cases, really proven players in others. Those guys or others need to make big plays on defense against a Northern Illinois team that has not been great on offense. They're a good defensive squad, but maybe the Wolfpack can create turnovers, create big plays, change field position, just take some pressure off a Wolfpack offense that has not been able to find itself so far this season. And that offense at State will be facing a Northern Illinois defense that drove Notre Dame crazy and has actually looked good through all 3 of its games so far.
All right, DG, let's wrap up this opening segment with maybe a game or two that are involving at least one in-state team that you think might be worth a brief mention, and why.
Yeah, I'd say that there are 2. 2-1 Louisiana visits 1-2 Wake Forest, and then 2-2 UTSA visits 2-2 East Carolina in Greenville. The Demon Deacons are coming off an embarrassing 40-6 home loss to a highly ranked Ole Miss team, and the Pirates are coming off back-to-back defeats against App State and then Liberty on the road. Here's the bottom line in my eyes for both. As I said in the preseason regarding 2 teams that, remember, both went off the rails last year and missed the postseason entirely, didn't even come close, a bowl should be the goal in both Winston-Salem and Greenville. If Wake is going to get to 6 or more wins, it needs to beat Louisiana. Louisiana is a program that's had 6 consecutive bowl seasons. It's a group of 5 opponent, but a pretty well-run program. Deeks need to win that game in Winston-Salem if they're going to get to 6 or more victories. If ECU is going to get to 6 or more wins this season, it needs to beat UTSA, a program that has averaged 10 wins over the last 3 seasons, and the Pirates need to get that done in part because it is on their home field at Dowdy-Ficklin in Greenville. There's just not much wiggle room on those 2 teams' schedules, Wake Forest and East Carolina, and there are some even tougher opponents looming later. So it's important for both the Deacons and the Pirates to take one significant step in the right direction with a victory this Saturday.
All right, we're up against a timeout. We'll have more on This Week in College Football with David Glenn, presented by the North Carolina Port Council, when we come back on the North Carolina Sports Network.
Michael Berard, Managing Director Investments with the Founders Group at Stifel, works with a select group of high net worth individuals and institutions to develop and implement investment plans tailored to their specific objectives and risk tolerances. If you are interested in highly personalized, well-researched guidance and outstanding personal service, you can contact Michael at 984-364-2002. That's 984-364-2002. Stifel Nicholas and Company Incorporated, member SIPC and NYSE. If you are anywhere near Wilmington, North Carolina, and looking for a little live music, a cold beer, a tangy slushie, a fun crowd, or just a taste of the good life at the beach, Jimmy's Bar in Wrightsville Beach is the place for you. Located on North Lumina Avenue, just 1 block from the sand and waves of the Atlantic Ocean, Jimmy's features a full bar with nightly beer and drink specials and it hosts musical performers almost every day of the year. One more fun fact, Jimmy's annual children's bike drive, which started in 2017, now distributes more than 1,000 bicycles and helmets per year to young people in the Wilmington area and beyond. Jimmy's Bar, your home away from home on Lumina Avenue in Wrightsville Beach.
Welcome back to This Week in College Football with David Glenn, presented by our friends in the North Carolina Port Council right here on the North Carolina Sports Network. Okay, DG, diving right into our ACC and National Week 5 look ahead, brought to you by our good friends at Excel Moving and Storage, a family-owned Allied Vans partner here in North Carolina with 25 years of award-winning experience that can help you with your move to North Carolina, within North Carolina, or away from North Carolina, even internationally, while also assisting with all of your storage needs. Learn more at excelms.com. That's Excel Moving and Storage. There are 4 top 25 versus top 25 matchups on the Week 5 national schedule, and DG, one of them involves an ACC team, so we'll certainly get to that one, but we've got to start with the big one that we're anticipating on Saturday. Number 2, Georgia at number 4, Alabama. This is the primetime game on ABC. Bulldogs, a 1-point road favorite in Tuscaloosa.
Yeah, this may surprise a lot of people to learn that Alabama has won 8 of the last 9 games in this rivalry, including the 2021 and 2023 Southeastern Conference Championship games, with the only Georgia victory in the past 16 years in this rivalry being the Bulldogs' win over the Crimson Tide in the national championship game at the end of the 2021 season, technically the 2022 calendar year, because it was January by that point. Of course, Coach Nick Saban was in charge of Alabama for that very long period of the Tide's dominance over the Bulldogs, and that Saban guy did retire after last season. So now it's up to the new Tide coach, Kalen DeBoer, formerly the head coach and a successful one at both Fresno State and Washington, to keep the Tide rolling in this rivalry. But now Georgia coach Kirby Smart, who of course was a longtime assistant under Saban at Alabama, has won 2 of the last 3 national championships, and his Bulldogs, wait until you hear these numbers, his Bulldogs have averaged 12 wins a year over the last 7 seasons. We've never seen that level of college football in the great state of North Carolina, I can promise you that. The Dogs have averaged 12 wins a year, over 7 seasons, during which the Dogs have finished in the national top 8 every single year during that stretch. Over the last 3+ seasons, Georgia's record is, wait for it, 45 wins and 2 losses. I do not think it's an exaggeration to say that the Bulldogs are in the midst of one of the greatest dynasties in the history of college football. The Dogs are, last I saw, you mentioned 1 point. It may have shifted to 2 points. The Dogs are only a 2-point favorite, despite that amazing resume I just mentioned, in this particular game, in part because the game is in Tuscaloosa, as you said, and I think in part because Georgia, which, remember, destroyed Clemson 34-3 in the season opener, really struggled offensively and barely survived a road game at Kentucky last week. Final score, Bulldogs 13, Wildcats 12. Meanwhile, Alabama has completely destroyed all 3 of its opponents, including Wisconsin 42-10 at Wisconsin last week. A lot of the focus is going to be on the quarterbacks in this one. Top NFL prospect Carson Beck of the Bulldogs, Jalen Milroe of the Tide. Also keep an eye out for Alabama's freshman wide receiver, Ryan Williams. He's been one of the best first-year players in the entire country. Huge numbers so far this season, although this time, obviously, he's going up against a Georgia defense that has given up only 6 points per game so far this season. There isn't a game this year where you're going to see more NFL caliber talent on the field. So it is must-see TV for most college football fans when Alabama and Georgia get together on Saturday night.
All right, what about this quasi-ACC game? Number 15, Louisville, 3-0, off the win over Georgia Tech last week. They're at number 16, Notre Dame, 3-1, only lost for the Irish to Northern Illinois. We talked about that earlier. This is a 3:30 game on Saturday from South Bend. If you want to watch it, well, it's streaming only on Peacock. Fighting Irish, a 6-point favorite at home over Louisville.
Yeah, with their home win over Georgia Tech last week, I thought the Cardinals, who remember played Florida State in last year's ACC title game, finally showed that they deserve their national ranking and they should be considered among the 3 or 4 best candidates to end up in this year's ACC championship game. Maybe behind Miami and Clemson in this revised ACC pecking order and alongside a couple of other ACC teams. But 7th-year senior Tyler Shuck, a guy we mentioned last week, is playing very well as Louisville's new starting quarterback. He's completed almost 70% of his passes in Coach Jeff Brom's offense with 8 touchdown passes and 0 interceptions. That is about as efficient as it gets. It's still early, but that's impressive stuff. The wide receiver at Louisville, Ja'Cory Brooks, he's an Alabama transfer and a former Prep All-American. He is in the midst of what may end up being his college breakthrough campaign. He's leading the ACC with about 100 receiving yards per game and just looks like a special talent. I've also been really impressed by Louisville's defense so far. They held Georgia Tech to only 19 points, and for the season, the Cardinals are giving up only 11 points per game and about 270 yards per game. Both of those defensive numbers rank among the ACC's leaders right now. Last thing, Notre Dame, of course, is led by the former Duke quarterback, Riley Leonard. The Irish beat Mike Elko and Texas A&M in College Station in their season opener, but then they were shocked at home by Northern Illinois. Since then, Notre Dame has absolutely pummeled both Purdue and Miami, Ohio, and the Irish defense in particular looks especially good this season. Louisville did prove against Georgia Tech that it was ready for a step up in competition, and now this trip to the hallowed grounds of Notre Dame Stadium offers the Cardinals one more very challenging step up that competitive ladder.
All right, let's talk about the Friday night game in the ACC. Friday night, ESPN 7:30, Virginia Tech, they're 2-2 at number 7, Miami, the Hurricanes 4-0. They are an 18-point home favorite, are the Hurricanes, on Friday night at Hard Rock Stadium down in Coral Gables.
Yeah, I wanted to highlight this game in part because that Friday night television window does offer only 2 games. It's the Hokies at the Hurricanes in the ACC, and it's 3-1 Washington at 3-0 Rutgers in the Big Ten. So this will be a lot of folks' first or maybe second chance to see Miami in more of an up-close and personal sort of way. By the way, both of Virginia Tech's losses earlier this year were very close games at Vandy of the SEC in overtime, 26-23 against that undefeated Rutgers team of the Big Ten. So we'll see how the Hokies show up. But here's the bottom line in my eyes for the Hurricanes. They have the best offensive numbers in the ACC at 52 points per game so far. They have the best defensive numbers in the ACC at only 10 points per game yielded so far. They have several of the most impressive transfers in the ACC, including that preseason player of the year we've been talking about from the ACC and Cam Ward, the Washington State transfer, 5th-year senior quarterback who has absolutely lived up to the hype so far. He's completing 72% of his passes, 360 passing yards per game, 14 TD passes against only 2 interceptions, and he has really raised the confidence level of the Hurricanes, especially on the offensive side of the ball. The Canes have 4 different running backs they really like, including the Oregon State transfer, Damian Martinez, who was all Pac-12 with the Beavers out there. Exciting true freshman named Jordan Lyle, who was a big part of Coach Mario Cristobal's most recent recruiting class, which was very highly regarded. The Canes also have 4 or 5 wide receivers they really like, led by the 5th-year senior Xavier Restrepo, and they have some talented tight ends, including redshirt junior Elijah Arroyo, who has always been talented in Coral Gables, but previously limited by injuries. The UM offensive line is also one of the best in the ACC. So that's a lot to build on. On defense, a Tennessee transfer named Tyler Barron has looked like one of the premier D linemen in the entire league. A linebacker, Kiko Mauigoa, looks like an all-conference player for the 2nd year in a row for the Canes. A Washington transfer named Mish Powell looks like one of the best safeties in the ACC. Remember, he played for the Huskies in last year's national title game, so he's been in big environments. And Darryl Porter Jr., who's a local guy for the Canes, but started his career at West Virginia, he's developed into an NFL prospect on the defensive side of the ball as well. Last thing about the Canes, because a lot of people looked at me sideways in the preseason, given the Canes' history of face planting after high expectations in their 2 decades now as ACC members. When I listed the Canes as a serious contender for the ACC title this year, there were some weird looks, and I understood why, as you and I have discussed for weeks now. But this is year 3 for Mario Cristobal as the head coach at his alma mater. He was there when they were building that reputation as a 5-time national champion, meaning he played on some of those great teams. And that year 3 is often a time that a new staff's recruiting can fully dominate the depth chart, which is exactly what is happening at UM right now. Both incoming transfers, some we mentioned, and a bunch of high school recruits, one of which I mentioned. These guys are from back-to-back recruiting classes that were ranked in the national top 10 under Mario Cristobal, meaning 2023 and 2024. Also, last thing, the Canes are one of the only teams in the ACC that returned 8 of its 10 full-time assistant coaches from last year, including both of their coordinators, Shannon Dawson on offense, Lance Guidry on defense. I think that kind of staff continuity can really help a lot, and I think it's a big part of Miami's success story so far this season.
All right, let's take a break. We'll come back and have more of This Week in College Football with David Glenn, presented by our friends at the North Carolina Port Council, right here on the North Carolina Sports Network. Sorry. Quick swig of some unsweet tea. It's terrific. In 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to This Week in College Football with David Glenn, presented by the North Carolina Port Council right here on the North Carolina Sports Network. Okay, DG, diving right into our coaches and quarterback segment, brought to you by our good friends at Lawson Insurance, who are about to celebrate their 50th anniversary of helping DG and many other North Carolina citizens and businesses with their personal and commercial insurance needs. You can reach out to the brothers, Ken Miller and Michael Lawson, and like us, they're all huge sports fans. Give them a call, 919-846-2090, or by searching Lawson Insurance online. Okay, DG. Now, in their most recent games, 4 in-state head coaches saw their teams get beaten pretty bad. UNC coach Mack Brown lost to James Madison 70-50 at home. It was the most points Carolina has ever given up at Kenan Stadium. Wake Forest and their coach Dave Clawson, they lost at home to number 6 Ole Miss 40-6. Appalachian State and their head coach Sean Clark lost 48-14 to South Alabama. Guess where? You guessed it, at home, in a Thursday night national televised game on ESPN. And then, of course, Saturday on the road this time in Death Valley, NC State and their coach Dave Doran trailed the Tigers 45-7 at halftime before they lost to number 17 Clemson 59-35. So we'll take all of these coaches individually, and you let us know where things stand with their coaching tenure, their football teams, and maybe their respective relationships with their athletic directors and or their presidents or chancellors. We'll start in Chapel Hill with Mack Brown, year 6 of Coach Brown's second tenure there. Carolina 3-1 coming off that loss to JMU, and as we've already documented, playing Duke on the road for the Victory Bell this week.
Yeah, the James Madison game was an absolute embarrassment to UNC football. And Mack Brown knew that and addressed it exactly in those terms in the aftermath of that debacle. You cannot lose to a group of 5 team at home with the game essentially over by halftime and the home fans streaming for the exits, while also ultimately giving up, as you said, the most points, 70, by a visiting team in Kenan Stadium history. That UNC defense was mentally, physically, and emotionally unprepared for that football game, and that reflects really poorly on Mack Brown and especially defensive coordinator Jeff Collins and his entire staff and players on that side of the ball. For the record, Mack Brown makes $5 million a year with the Tar Heels, and his most recent contract extension, signed after the 2022 season, goes all the way through the 2028 campaign, meaning 4 more seasons after this one. However, unlike the other coaches that we're going to discuss today, Chris, Mack Brown's situation is unique, and the details of his contract really don't matter all that much, and I'll tell you why. He's 73 years old. He's already in the Hall of Fame. He's already won a national championship. He doesn't need the money. And his relationship with UNC is such that he could easily transition into a fundraising type role without any sort of expensive buyout, assuming all parties were agreeable on that snapshot. There's still time to make something of this season for Coach Brown and all these others we'll discuss, obviously. But Athletic Director Bubba Cunningham and Mac will be having regular conversations about the future because remember, UNC not only has a Mac Brown question right now, that university must decide whether or not it really wants to invest in football to a degree required to keep up in a world that's currently dominated by the football programs of the Big Ten and the SEC and a couple of other schools, Notre Dame, Clemson, Florida State, that might be targets at some point of the Big Ten and or the SEC. Those same two leagues easily could extend an invitation expansion style to the North Carolina Tar Heels someday, depending on how those ACC, Florida State, Clemson lawsuits continue to play out. So as there's a Mac Brown question, meaning 2024, 2025, I think there's an even more important big picture question for Carolina about where it wants the sport of football, the very expensive sport of football, but one that also can pay a lot of bills. Where does UNC want it to be in the bigger picture of its university mission and its athletic department mission? The Mac Brown answer is tied into that broader answer, and regardless of how many games the Heels win or lose the rest of the way, that bigger picture question isn't going away anytime soon.
All right, what about in Winston-Salem? Dave Clawson in his 11th year with the Demon Deacons. They're coming off a 4-8 season last year. Very disappointing year for Wake Forest a season ago, and now they're 1-2 after their loss to Ole Miss at home a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, let me start this question right here, or this answer rather, this conversation. Since the ACC was created in 1953, Wake Forest has had 13 football coaches. You ready for this? Mm-hmm. None of the previous 12 finished with even a winning record, more victories than defeats during their time with the Demon Deacons. Our old friend Jim Grobe actually came closest. He ended up 77-82 after his 13 seasons in Winston-Salem. Now, Dave Clawson succeeded Grobe in 2014, of course, and as we speak, Coach Clawson's record as the head coach at Wake Forest through 10-plus seasons at this stage is 64 wins and 63 losses. I bring that up because Wake Athletic Director John Curry, who is a Wake Forest graduate himself, knows very well, given that context I just outlined, that it is very difficult to win consistently in football at Wake Forest. And John Curry also knows that Dave Clawson is one of the best coaches, if not the best, in the history of that program. So there is no hot seat in play right now in Winston-Salem, even though Wake went 4-8 last year, and even though they are coming off that 40-6 annihilation at the hands of number 6 Ole Miss. The more interesting angle here to me is Dave Clawson's attitude at 57 years old and with a lot of money in the bank about trying to win at Wake Forest when so many things are stacked against him and that school and that program in major college football. Dave Clawson did know when he took the Wake job, of course, more than a decade ago, he's a very smart guy, that it is hard to win in a major conference when you're coaching at the small private university that has very high academic standards that can complicate recruiting and a relatively small athletics budget that can complicate facilities and coaching staffs and a lot of other things. But that world has gotten even tougher in recent years with immediately eligible transfers, the explosion of name, image, likeness money, and a lot of other things. Coach Dave Clawson actually vented some about those mounting frustrations after the Ole Miss humbling defeat, talking about how the Rebels could just go out there and buy players with NIL money in a way that is beyond the reach or at least the scope of what can be done at Wake Forest. The Demon Deacons had little to no chance of beating the Rebels. And deep down inside, I think Dave Clawson knew that. How long does he want to continue to be this David fighting amongst a whole bunch of Goliaths? That is the biggest question for Wake Forest football right now, not whether Dave Clawson's on any kind of hot seat or not.
What about in Boone, where Sean Clark is in year 5 at App State, his alma mater, former offensive lineman for the Mountaineers, but they're 2-2, and both of their losses, DG, have been pretty big margins of defeat, both at Clemson and, as we mentioned, at home last week to South Alabama.
Yeah, I don't enjoy saying this out loud because I really like Coach Clark personally, but I personally believe that his situation is closer to a true hot seat conversation than any of these 4 in-state coaches that we're discussing today, in part because of those absolute wipeouts you mentioned against Clemson, and especially last Thursday night on national TV against South Alabama. Again, at home on national TV in front of a huge crowd and a nationwide TV audience. That makes it hurt even more, given that South Alabama is a member of your league, whereas lots of teams, again, would go to Clemson and get slaughtered this season. Unlike UNC and unlike Wake Forest, Appalachian State is absolutely, positively a football-first athletic department, and all major decisions there are made with that in mind. Over the last decade, the Mountaineers have successfully transitioned from being one of the best FCS programs in the entire country, multi-time national champion at that level, to one of the best programs, at least in the Sun Belt Conference, at the FBS level. We gave you those amazing numbers earlier in today's show, where only Alabama and 5 other heavyweights have won more games than the Mountaineers have won at the FBS level over this past decade. As I mentioned earlier, Coach Clark already has on his resume, it was back in 2022, one of App State's 2 non-winning seasons of the last 30 years. That is a big and a bad deal in Boone. The only other one, by the way, came under Scott Satterfield in 2013. He went 4-8 during what was the Mountaineers' transition season from FCS to FBS, so he got the benefit of the doubt, as he should have. And Coach Sat went on to 5 straight winning seasons at App State right after that rough start. Coach Clark simply cannot afford a second non-winning season. This is only his 5th year as the head coach at his alma mater. The Mountaineers are the underdog against Liberty this week, so there's a chance at least that they'll start 2-3 with difficult games still ahead at Marshall, at Louisiana, at Coastal Carolina, plus a tough-looking home game against that James Madison team that just beat the Tar Heels in Chapel Hill. App just doesn't look great in the trenches right now to me, and that usually makes for an unpredictable roller coaster ride of a season. Coach Clark's current contract runs through 2026, meaning 2 more seasons after this one. The App State athletic director, Doug Gillen, who hired Clark, remember, understandably puts the bar in a high place for his football program. So Coach Clark probably knows deep down inside that another 6-6 regular season in Boone probably would lead to some very difficult postseason conversations in that great college football town. Time to change that equation, but it would certainly help a lot if the Mountaineers could beat Liberty this Saturday.
All right, what about in Raleigh, where Dave Doran is in year 12 as the head coach of the Wolfpack? Both of their losses, State has gotten blitzed by Tennessee and Charlotte, and now last weekend on the road at Clemson. What do you make of Coach Doran's situation?
Yeah, this is the one and only situation among these 4 head coaches we're discussing where the contract details do matter a lot. And by the way, I'm not making any assumptions, good or bad, about the rest of the Wolfpack season. The Pack's 2 toughest regular season opponents by a mile were top 10 Tennessee and a Clemson team that may be on its way to being ranked in the national top 10. They're in the rearview mirror. There are some challenging opponents ahead for sure for the Pack, but there are no scary good teams the rest of the way, at least not in the regular season. Because of the contract extension that Dave Doran received from athletic director Boo Corrigan after last season, when the Wolfpack, remember, went 9-4 and finished in the national top 25, Dave Doran is signed all the way through the 2029 campaign, meaning 5 more years after the current one. Doran makes more than $5 million a year under his current deal. That is before bonuses. And about $3 million of that annual money is in the form of his salary. Under the contract's buyout clause, if you had to fire a coach, just hypothetically, it would be the salary amount times the number of years remaining on the contract. So as we speak, that would be $3 million a year roughly times the 5 years remaining. That's $15 million to fire Dave Doran before you deal with his assistant coaches, before you hire a new head coach and his staff. That is just an extremely unlikely mathematical formula given the current financial situation and the upcoming change at University Chancellor at NC State. So Dave Doran's contract, which he earned the extension with last year's quality season, that is going to protect him if he needs protecting later this season.
All right, let's use our final timeout. We'll come back and have more DG on This Week in College Football, presented by the North Carolina Port Council, right here on the North Carolina Sports Network.
Michael Berard, Managing Director Investments with the Founders Group at Stifel, works with a select group of high net worth individuals and institutions to develop and implement investment plans tailored to their specific objectives and risk tolerances. If you are interested in highly personalized, well-researched guidance and outstanding personal service, you can contact Michael at 984-364-2002. That's 984-364-2002. Stifel Nicholas and Company Incorporated, member SIPC and NYSE. I am a better person and a more effective business owner for having known and learned from Emily Parks over many years now. Emily's company, Organize for Success, helps multi-passionate business owners and executives bring harmony to all the layers of their lives, from work to side projects, from friends and family to hobbies, community, and beyond. With Emily's help, you too can make every minute matter. She helps you determine what earns your time and how to efficiently accomplish what matters. One of the many things I love about Emily is that she does not impose her will on her clients. She listens to them. That way she can better help them cultivate the lives they want to live. You can set up a complimentary call with Emily today by visiting organizeforsuccess.com.
Welcome back to This Week in College Football with David Glenn, presented by our friends at the North Carolina Port Council, right here on the North Carolina Sports Network. Our focus of our show is going to be mostly forward-looking, as you know. We're going to do that as often as possible. But, DG, we are going to take a quick glance back at the previous weekend in college football, just because, you know, DG, he's that guy that follows those intriguing trends and has the angles and unique observations and historical perspectives that you really can't find anywhere else. So with that thought in mind, we bring you our quick glance back to week 4, brought to you by our great friends at Jimmy's Bar and King Neptune Restaurant in Wrightsville Beach. Jimmy's has a full bar, nightly drink specials, and live music 365 days a year. And right next door, King Neptune has become one of the best restaurants in the entire greater Wilmington area. Keep up with Jimmy's on Facebook and learn more about King Neptune Restaurant at neptuneswb.com. Now, week 4 offered some really intriguing developments beyond those we've already mentioned in our program this week. DG, the game that you and Mike Waddell and others from our North Carolina Sports Network staff were at to see in person this past week, North Carolina Central, a dominant win, 66-24 over North Carolina A&T in Durham, and that long-standing rivalry we know as the Aggie Eagle Classic. So let's start here. What were your biggest takeaways from your visit to Kelly Riddick Stadium for that tailgate tour stop in the great rivalry matchup this past Saturday night?
It's funny, man. My biggest takeaways were mostly personal rather than professional. I saw a head basketball coach at NC Central, Lavelle Moten, who everybody knows by now, given his prominent place in North Carolina sports world, given my various platforms in this state. He and I have just a beautiful relationship. It's professional. It's personal. It's a mutual admiration society, and I got to see him and interview him on the way into the game, and it was just part of the fun that Mike and I and our staff had there. But the way we're embraced, Chris, is just unbelievable. I first covered the Aggie Eagle Classic as a sports writer for the Durham Herald-Sun newspaper. It was either the late 80s or the early 1990s. So that's how often I've been around this game, which, of course, matches the two largest historically black colleges and universities here in the state of North Carolina. They've been playing each other in various sports for more than a century. And at different times, each has won the HBCU national championship in football, and I mean relatively recently, multiple times for the Aggies, once fairly recently under Coach Trey Oliver with the North Carolina Central Eagles. Those who were cooking invited us close to talk about their cooking. Those in the band invited us close to hear about how they do things at halftime and with their world-famous music. The dance teams, the cheerleaders allow us to pause for photographs. I got photos with both the NC Central or the North Carolina A&T Bulldog and the Eagle of North Carolina Central. I mean, that might be just jinxing myself. Are you allowed to be photographed with both sides at the Eagle Classic? I'm not sure. But from the administrators, Bulldog Smith, and so many others at NC Central, we get the same kind of red carpet treatment when the game is at North Carolina A&T in Greensboro. It's become a wonderful part of various renditions of my tailgate tours. I knew, as we discussed last week, I knew the Eagles were better than the Aggies in football terms, and this was the third straight win for Central over A&T on the gridiron. A&T historically has the best of this rivalry. Trey Oliver has swung the pendulum back to Central. So I liked the football. And I think NC Central is a quality team again this year. But I just love the pageantry, the fellowship, the friendliness, the camaraderie, the festivities outside the stadium prior to the football being kicked off. It's one of the special events and one of my favorite events in any sport across North Carolina. And we were just honored to be a part of it again this year. And we're incredibly appreciative the way truly dozens and dozens of people embrace us as members of their extended family, whether they were rooting for the Aggies or they were rooting for the Eagles on Saturday night.
All right, let's wrap up the show here. Among our in-state teams and players at any level of college football, who else did you see as deserving of a shout-out based on their performance in Week 4 last week?
A few real quick. Shout out to Lenore Ryan, based in Hickory, North Carolina, which made the semifinals of the Division II football playoffs last year under Coach Mike Jacobs, our guest on the David Glenn Show. And it's off to another great start this season. The Bears are now 3-0. They're up to number 6 in the national rankings under their new head coach, Doug Sosha, after their 29-21 victory over Mars Hill last week. We'll continue to follow that story, of course. Shout out to head coach Maurice Flowers and Johnson C. Smith University, based in Charlotte, which is off to, wait for this, Chris, its first 4-0 start since 1982.
I wasn't alive, DG.
You were not. I was, I think, in middle school. The Golden Bulls are getting a lot of votes for the top 25. I can promise you it's been a long time since they've been there. After knocking off number 21, nationally ranked Virginia Union, which was last year's CIAA football champion. They did that in Division II play last week. Coach Flowers is a Johnson C. Smith alum. He has worked his way up the high school first and then college coaching ranks as an assistant since his days as a high school football star himself at East Mecklenburg High School right there in Charlotte. So it's just a fun story to see him off to such a great start this season with the Johnson C. Smith program that is not in these sorts of headlines very often.
Well, that's going to do it for us this week here, DG. Big thanks to the North Carolina Port Council for being a founding partner of the North Carolina Sports Network. And we welcome Atlantic Tire and Service, now with 6 locations in the Triangle, as our newest sponsor. A quick reminder, DG and his staff post daily articles at our fast-growing website, ncsportsnetwork.com, which also has direct links on its homepage to this YouTube channel, the wide variety of places you can get on-demand audio and podcast of our show, The David Glenn Show, and all the other offerings, and updates on year 2 of our Old North State tailgate and traveling sports circus, which this week will be at Appalachian State in Boone for the big matchup between the Mountaineers and the Liberty Flames. Liberty 4-0. That's a 3:30 non-conference game in Boone on Saturday. Now, we're also looking forward to our October 11th through October 13th trip to the beach in Wilmington for our North Carolina Port Council football weekend at the beach. which will include so many great stops, including one to see our good friend Bob Hubbard at the original Salt Works, plus Jimmy and Keaton Galeese at Jimmy's Bar and King Neptune Restaurant in Wrightsville Beach. So a lot going on here on the North Carolina Sports Network. For David Glenn, I'm Chris Edwards. Thanks again for joining us, as always, for This Week in College Football with David Glenn, presented by the North Carolina Port Council, right here on the North Carolina Sports Network.